Hi, Edward.
Hi, how are you?
Fine, thanks for having us. Let's start if you want to. We are ready here with a lot of people.
Sure.
Okay, thank you for having us. It's a pleasure to be with you, Edward. And just to start with a general question, I want you to give us your general view about what's the general situation today when it comes to intelligence and surveillance around the world.
This is a very big question, and it's a difficult question. The status quo today is surrounding a shift between the traditional forms of intelligence sharing that have worked for generations, which would be human intelligence, very similar to journalism, where you've got agents of government who are told to go after a particular intelligence requirement, right? They say gather information about the enemy's ship movements, if it's a time of war, go to conferences, discover information about this technology, monitor this group, monitor this political movement, and rather than publishing it in the newspapers, right, publish it just for the government. That's what intelligence agencies in many ways have always been. They've been journalists who only work for the government, right? Which sounds not so bad until you start thinking about how that information is actually applied. And it's not used in as benign a manner as traditional journalism is, because it's used to report on things that newspapers normally never would. Newspapers don't investigate the activities of private citizens. They investigate matters of public interest. But intelligence agents investigate what they consider to be the national interest, right? And here's where things start to get tricky. Who defines what the national interest is? Particularly in the last 15 years, in this post 9/11 era, we've had the rise of this language of national security, of homeland security, where on the basis of terrorism, practically any intelligence authority can be justified, any oversight restrictions can be done away with, because politicians can say we're facing a period of extraordinary threat, extraordinary dangers. History has never seen criminals such as these. If we're going to stop terrorist attacks, if we're going to stop kidnappings and murders, you have to take the chains off us and allow us to do whatever we want, really, quickly, effectively, without the involvement of the courts, without having to go for warrants, immediately the traditional processes. Now, this human-driven intelligence in the same period has given way to electronic intelligence gathering. Now, of course, this has been happening for about 100 years, but it has accelerated entirely new direction in the last 15 years, where we have seen a new dynamic occurring, which is called mass surveillance. Governments around the world prefer to call this bulk collection rather than mass surveillance, but this is a departure from that traditional means of targeted surveillance, where somebody somewhere in a government office has to say, these are the people we're going after. You would hope they would then go to a court, ask for a warrant for some kind of police investigation, to interfere with their rights, to abrogate their right to privacy, where the court would review the evidence brought against them and say, even if it's ex parte, even if the other party is not permitted into the court, the judge believes there is enough evidence here to establish probable cause, to say that a violation of rights, a search of a home, the planting of a camera in a vehicle or some listening device, all of these things are reasonable given the threat presented by these individuals. Mass surveillance does away with all of that. Bulk collection does away with all of that, and says instead, because of the way that the modern world works, with all of us having cell phones, with all of us having computers, with people having Facebook accounts, swiping credit cards, all of these records are being created as a result of your activities. Everywhere you go, every purchase you make, every number you dial, every cell phone tower you pass, every bus you sit on and friend you are next to when you have a phone in your pocket, these things are recorded. They're not recorded by you. They're recorded by the devices and services that you interact with every day. Now, governments can simply go to the corporations that are providing these capabilities, or the civil infrastructure, if it's a national telecommunications company or something similar, and say, we want access to your records. We need copies of all the communications that are moving through your telecommunications facility that we can start to search through. Now, this is the broad technological dynamic and trend, is this argument between, is it justified, is it appropriate to collect in advance of any criminal wrongdoing, of any individualized suspicion of harm, meaning that the government thinks you did something wrong, to collect your communications and everybody else's communications just in case you become of interest, or perhaps you're connected to someone who is of interest. But this gets us into sort of a broader question, again, of that context of national security. And when you start watching everyone, when you start collecting information on everyone, the balance of power between ordinary citizens, between civil society, and these intelligence agencies in the government is moved in a very new way that we've never had to deal with before. And unfortunately, in most countries around the world today, this rebalancing is happening in the dark, without the knowledge of the public, and in many cases without their consent. We see some efforts to, in a very limited way, legislate, perhaps regulate some of these activities. But right now it's very bare, and the challenge is our oversight of these organizations, understanding how these determinations are made about how to use the information that is collected, who is targeted by these agencies, and ultimately who decides what is sort of in the nation's interest and what is national security in this current context, is happening invisibly and unaccountably.
In that ground, you more or less mentioned it, but let me reinforce that point, and that is the why. Why is control over intelligence activities so crucial?
Yeah, I briefly mentioned this point of sort of national interest, national security, who decides. But what we need to think about here is the fact that the public at large has been targeted by a ongoing information campaign, a persuasion campaign that is intentional among governments, right? And this isn't just Argentina, this isn't just the United States, this is everywhere. Doesn't matter how different the countries are, where because of this rise of terrorism, or at least this specter of terrorism, regardless of how rare it is, they say we're in danger. And so, of course, people go, well, how do we become safe again? How do we prevent those dangers? How do we counter those threats? And this gave rise to this language of national security. But that's not entirely new. It's just replacing terms that had fallen out of favor from the past, which were state security. Whether you call it national security, whether you call it state security, whether you talk about internal stability, what we're really describing is not the public interest. It's a governmental interest. It's a political interest, right? This has happened through every state security bureau throughout the history of society, where ultimately it becomes about protecting the status quo, perpetuating sort of the stability of the continuing governance of the time, more so than it is truly representing the interests of public citizens at large, because these are organizations, again, that operate in the dark, without direct public control, without direct civilian control. And by civilian here, I don't mean simply non-military. I mean civil control, non-governmental control, right? Civil society's control and influence. And why this matters is when you set aside these things and sort of suddenly governance starts to happen in the dark, intelligence collection happens in the dark, we don't actually know what's happening, it inevitably results in abuse, right? This is not something that's a potential risk. This is not something that could happen. We're not sure it's happening, or we recognize it's possible, but it's unlikely. In every case, in every country where we have had a strong and secret intelligence organization, we have seen abuses. The United States, I think, is actually a good example of this, because while many people, have different opinions about is the United States government the best government in the world, most would agree that it's not the worst government in the world. However, it's certainly an extraordinarily powerful one. And despite the fact that it does have such extraordinary powers, and I think most people would like to think that it at least tries to do positive things. When you look at the history of its intelligence organizations, particularly those operating domestically, particularly those operating in the name of national security, such as our FBI, which is our domestic intelligence agency, they wrote a story once that said, we've identified an individual in the country who represents a threat. They're a prominent religious leader, community advocate that we suspect is a sleeper agent trying to destabilize society. They're connecting with foreign radicals. They're trying to overthrow the order of the day. Our top executive judicial official in the United States, the Attorney General, right, the lawyer representing the United States, has been briefed on this man and approved wiretaps of his home and his office. Even though he is a US citizen and he should be benefiting from the protections of our laws, we're placing him on a secret watch list to be detained in the event of a national emergency, right? These threats of terrorism, they go hot, and suddenly we have a domestic resistance, we have conflict and strife. And of all of the people that the agency is watching, they think he's dangerous of all from the standpoint of national security. Again, this is where that language comes in. National security. When they justify watching this person, this dangerous man, they say it's to protect the nation. Does anyone recognize who this individual is? Since this is US history, I'm going to presume maybe not. It's Dr. Martin Luther King, the most famous civil rights leader in American history. And this was given 2 days after he gave his most famous speech, not advocating military radicalism, not advocating resistance against the government, but calling for racial equality and social justice. 2 days after he gave that speech, suddenly an intelligence organization said he was the most dangerous man in the country. Very shortly thereafter, the FBI wrote a letter that they classified and remained classified for about 50 years, that they mailed to him in secret. And this letter was trying to convince him to kill himself. They said they had been watching him. They had been recording him. They knew that he was meeting with women who were not his wife in hotel rooms. And this is after it had been learned that he was to receive the Nobel Peace Prize for his activism. And the FBI wanted to convince this man to kill himself before that award was given to him. Of course, they failed. He was eventually assassinated, not by the FBI, as far as we know. But we didn't learn about this letter until very far after. And when we did learn about the letter, we only learned about a partial aspect of it because the government said it was classified. And it wasn't until again, the early 2000s, the last decade, that we actually got the full copy of the letter. And it wasn't because the FBI revealed it. It wasn't because they said 50 years is enough time to protect national security. It wasn't because they said no one would come to harm as a result and the nation wouldn't collapse, because this guy was never a terrorist or a threat to our nation to begin with, but because they accidentally misfiled the letter. And a researcher, an academic, found it in a national library where the government had accidentally delivered these records, and they published it. Now, this gets back to that central question you raised about oversight. These are the things that happen even in the best of legal paradigms, even with the best intentions, even when people broadly, even when officials broadly enjoy the trust of the country, because the FBI in the United States at this time was a very respected organization. It was not one that was, we looked at skeptically as sort of a great evil. We saw them as our defenders. But because we didn't know what was going on, but because we didn't have outside independent reviewers of their activities, they weren't targeting threats to our nation. They were targeting individuals who were engaging in activities that would embarrass the politicians of the day.
Ed, let's go a step forward. How can we impose more transparency and accountability over the intelligence community?
I wish I had a better answer here. We've tried a lot of things in a lot of different countries, and they don't seem to be working very well. The story of 2013 was, again, involving the United States. Global mass surveillance, right? We had a slide that many may recognize where the largest internet companies in the world were secretly cooperating with the United States government beyond what was required by law. Yes, they did have legal obligations where they had to provide some records to the government in response to a criminal warrant, in response to a judge's order. But they said, let's go further. Let's create a special process for the NSA, for the FBI, to access records about anybody who's not a US citizen without a warrant, simply on the basis of a broad general order that then analysts could use for anybody who doesn't have the legal protections of a US citizen, to just rifle through their emails, their communications. We saw that they were tapping fiber optic lines and everything like that. And again, this is in a country that has a very robust free press, right? We have a lot of very rich news organizations. We have a tremendous diversity of investigators because we have such a large population. And yet these programs have been operating for more than a decade without the public truly knowing about them. When the courts tried to get involved, because civil liberties organizations such as the American Civil Liberties Union, Amnesty International, sort of global human rights organizations, tried to drag the government into court, it got to our highest level of review. And the court said, we would love to rule on these issues. We would love to determine if the suspected mass surveillance that's happening is actually true, if it's actually occurring, if it's actually a violation of people's constitutional or human rights. But we can't, because the government is claiming that these things are secret. And of course, because they are a secret and you don't have documentation, you can't prove that it's true. Therefore, you don't have standing to sue in our courts. Therefore, we can't actually decide these issues. So if the courts can't keep the government straight, the Congress won't keep the government straight, right? Our parliaments and things like that, our legislative branches, because in the United States, some members of Congress did know. Some of them were briefed. We have 535 members of Congress in the United States. Only 8 of them, they're called the Gang of 8, only 8 of them are briefed on the full activities of the intelligence agency. And only around 20 of them are briefed generally on intelligence activities at a broader scale. They didn't stand up, they didn't protest, they didn't try to curtail these activities in a meaningful way. And of course, the president or the executive branch of government has no interest in curtailing these activities because the presidency is the group that actually directs them. So if our traditional model of checks and balances for all of the other parts of society, right, for regulating the economy, for imposing laws, for typical criminal justice operations, for taxation and regulation, investigation, if these three branches of government models fail and don't work in the intelligence context, what does? Well, journalism didn't. We do have intelligence oversight committees in the United States, but unfortunately they weren't very interested in doing their job because, due to campaign finance laws and so on and so forth in the United States, they gain more benefits, they gain more political support, they gain more in terms of campaign donations from industry, which is entirely legal in the United States. It's not considered corruption, from companies that make money from spying, for not saying anything than they do for protecting citizens' rights. So again, it raises this central question of, well, how do you remediate this? How do you actually fix this? And this is the question we're not sure about. I suspect the solution here is actually to place it in a non-governmental context. This is the only way we can ensure that the interests of the oversight bodies align more generally with the public at large than with any particular political faction that's in government, any particular branch of government. Simply make it non-governmental, divorce it from government. We need respected activists. We need respected legal experts. We need retired jurists. And ultimately, we should also submit to some level, I think, of perhaps international oversight. Not to say they have a full mandate of what we can do, because of course, every nation looks after its own interests, but we should consider generally what outside perspectives that are contrary to the traditional interests of these agencies can help us get a better quality outcome that we have not tried before.
You mentioned the branches of the government and so on, and you mentioned, but just briefly, about the media. Let me focus on that. Is the media doing its job?
Not well enough, but it's difficult to criticize them given the power of classification, right? When you can classify information, when you can make it secret, meaning if someone in government tells this to a journalist, if they share a document, they go to prison, this is a radical power. Many people don't consider it as such because it seems so normal. We've had it for so long nowadays. But we need to think about, when is secrecy truly necessary? For example, in the context of total war, when there are military operations that, are combating an existential threat, where the failure of this military operation will result in the end of our society, right? A catastrophic loss that will reshape the rights of millions. It will result in death, torture, rape, all kinds of violence, unimaginable outcomes. While we don't want to, think about the worst case at all times, there have been many points in society where these things have actually happened. And when the military goes to march over that hill to combat the enemy, we don't want the enemy to know that they're coming. These are what we consider to be legitimate secrets. But they have a shelf life. Once the military has gone over that hill, once the battle has been won, once they've moved on to the next part, this no longer needs to be secret. But this original power of secrecy, of classification, which largely grew out of World War II, or at least the era of world wars, has metastasized and expanded like a cancer. Other segments of governments, many other areas of operation that don't actually have the same balance of interests. They don't actually present the same grave risks. And they don't age in the same way. Now, military operations already we keep secret for far longer than we should. governments that have engaged in activities that are indefensible, that are violations of rights, make operations secret and keep them secret, in many cases not to protect the loss of lives, but to shelter the government against a loss of reputation, to establish a culture of impunity for military officials who have engaged in acts of torture, kidnapping, and disappearance, and many other things. But when we get back to this question of accountability and journalists and are they doing their job, I think we have to bear in mind what the power of secrecy really means, this impact that it has. And we need to focus first on, can we reshape this? Can we tailor the powers of secrecy so that they are extraordinary, that they are mechanisms of last resort, that are used only when it is truly necessary and proportionate to the threat faced by the public's understanding of what's going on, and for the shortest period of time that information must remain secret. Now, this is to say, of course, we don't want to publish the names of every suspected terrorist who's under investigation. We don't want to publish the names of every mob boss out there who's being wiretapped. No one argues against this. No one's saying do away with law enforcement investigations. But what about when a journalist comes under investigation by an intelligence agency? They suspect this person's not really a journalist. There's some foreign agent, there's some spy. They do their investigation. They pry into this individual's private life. And it turns out they were wrong. Turns out this person actually was a journalist. Yes, they published critical reporting. Yes, maybe their reporting resulted in a change of policy. Maybe it injured the popularity of a particular politician. But they were actually working in the public interest, not as some kind of foreign agent. When should that become public? Well, the answer today is that it never does, or if it does, it happens after 30 years, after 50 years, far too long to actually consider were our policies right to enable this kind of investigation in the first place. And to share that information with journalists, with the press, of course, would be a crime. How do we remediate that? How do we correct for that? I would say that is the central question.
And where do you draw the line? I mean, you, Edward, draw the line between national security and the rights to privacy.
I actually don't see them coming into conflict very often, because this is what judicial process is for. And this is where we've actually seen things begin to get blurred. People seem to accept out of hand nowadays that terrorism is a military issue, but it never has been in the past, even when terrorism was a much greater problem, at least in primarily Western European society, than it is today. We operate under sort of an unquestioning belief in the United States, in France and Germany and the UK, that the rise of Islamic terrorism is claiming more lives than it ever has in the past, that it represents this sort of unique historical threat that's murdering so many, that we have to reorder our society around countering it. And yet today's terrorism, which is repugnant and indefensible, claims fewer lives in Western Europe today and in the last decade than it did in the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, decades of the past. So why is it that we've changed things so radically? Why is it that we're treating these things as a military threat today, particularly when we have some evidence that treating this as a criminal issue rather than a military issue actually was effective? And there is no evidence whatsoever today that responding to terrorism as a military issue is actually effective. The most powerful government in the world, like it or not, is the United States. And they have spent trillions of dollars in 15 years in Afghanistan and Iraq and other areas of the Middle East, claiming to fight a war on terror, and they haven't ended it. It's now our longest war, and there's no end in sight. Whereas when we countered threats of terrorism in decades past, As police threats, as criminal threats, we ended them quite quickly. This illustrates where we start to draw this line, which is in the involvement of the courts, the involvement of more segments of society, the more open response to these kind of difficult issues. Ultimately, the involvement of more minds results in better outcomes. And this stands to reason, right? When things start to be classified, when things start to be treated as military conflicts, military issues, what you're doing is you're removing a large part of the country's mind share out of the conversation, and you're replacing it with a few conversations between political officials, between military officials behind closed doors. But you cannot substitute the judgment of a few for the judgment of millions and expect to have a beneficial outcome from that. So when you ask me sort of how do I measure these threats, how do we sort of balance these things, the idea is that we involve the judiciary in an open adversarial process, one that is transparent to review and to challenge by the voices of the day to make sure that we're on the right path, right? And this is what mass surveillance, this kind of indiscriminate surveillance, this direction that we're going in, of increasing secrecy, of increasing militarization begins to fail. Because the minute governments start to say this is a military threat, what they're actually arguing is that the courts have no role in adjudicating our responses to these threats. And the courts ultimately are the things that we must rely on the most in defense of our rights. When courts are removed from the process, as they're being removed today, what we are starting to say is that rights don't really matter in determining how we're going to deal and respond to these challenges.
Let me ask you a very naive question. How does a government, any government, the US government, the Argentine government, win back the public's trust?
This is a this is a difficult question, and I think it illustrates a lot of the challenges that we're facing. We have this new rise of authoritarianism, of sort of reactionary policy. We have a regression in liberal societies around the world today, where governments simply do. They don't ask, they don't persuade, they don't convince, because they presume that the population is already convinced, because we've had a few good decades in the past. They presume a trust that is no longer there. Slowly, we're seeing that this trust is gone, and it raises this question that you ask of, okay, how do we restore this? How do we enjoy good governance again? How do we actually be able to establish a presumption that the government is acting in good faith? Because we want this, we need this. We want to have a just and benevolent government that can be trusted in most things. We never should trust it unthinkingly. We should verify its activities. But we should be able to, regardless. That's the goal, that's the desire. But I think the answer here is that trust can never be given. Trust must be earned. And the only way that governments can do this is by governing well, governing justly, and governing visibly, right? If someone, your neighbor, dresses up in military gear every day and sits on the bench outside your home when you come home from work, and every time you come in to your home at the end of your long work day, you ask them what they did, and they said they defended democracy. You never actually see them do anything. They disappear sometimes, but every time they come back, they say they did something good for you. They tell all of these stories about their extraordinary exploits. They've got a fan who writes all these stories about what they did. But you never actually see it because you're not allowed to. You ask them what actually happened, what are the details of this? You start to question about how they did this, how they achieved this great success, how they defended democracy, and they say, oh, I'm sorry, I can't tell you. If you knew, it would be dangerous. Would you trust this person? Should you trust this person? Now, obviously, government's a little bit more professional than that, But it raises the bare dynamic that justice must be seen to be done. Justice that happens in the dark is not justice at all. Governance that happens without the knowledge and consent of the public is many things, but I think most would agree it is not our aim, and it should not be our intention in an open and liberal society. Because what we're starting to do there is to substitute open government for sheer authoritarianism, a government that is founded not upon the principle of an informed consent granted by people who understand its activities, but rather a trust in personalities, a trust in claims, a trust in the hope that they will do the right thing. And if we develop that, if we succeed, if government does actually win our trust, because they go for some years and do operate in a way we should support, what happens when it changes? New government? What happens when suddenly there's an election and we have new officials that enjoy our trust because things have been good for so long, but now suddenly they have a very different set of values. They can govern in the dark. And they might make very different decisions. This is kind of the challenge that we're facing today in the United States with the result of the last election.
Before opening the door to questions from the public, let me ask you two brief questions myself. First one, given that the Russian winter is coming already, and given all that happened since 2013, would you do it again?
I would. I've thought about this a lot. I've talked to a lot of different individuals, including, I think the one who influenced me the most, who is Daniel Ellsberg, considered the father of American whistleblowing. He's a man who revealed in the 1970s a classified study of our Vietnam War. This was a criminal act. And the government did try to put him in jail for the rest of his life. Her perception of it was so criminal, so wild and ridiculous that the actual prosecution failed. And after they tried to bribe the judge and many other things, it eventually collapsed. And I talked to him about all of these things. Should I trust the government? All of these other things. He's actually more cynical than I am, but he convinced me that when we see something wrong, we have not just a right to say something about it, we have a duty to do something about it as best we can and as quickly as we can. Because with each year you wait, with every moment that you pause, these policies become more entrenched. The public's misunderstanding of reality becomes more difficult to change. And ultimately, these things can sometimes save or influence a war's worth of lives. So yeah, if I had to do, if I could step in a time machine, I would do this again, and I would do it sooner.
And the other one is, what about Trump? Or let me rephrase the question. What about President Trump? And I'm asking you, because you opened the door for this question with a tweet in which you tweeted that when the president won't pay taxes, should the citizen?
Yeah, there's a lot to be said about this, and ultimately we don't know much yet. We haven't seen his exercise of power or anything like that, but we have seen his claims. We have seen his avowed goals. And this is a dangerous thing because many of them are directly and combatively contrary to the Constitution of the United States. But we'll see on that. I think focusing on the individual misses the point. Even a president is just a president. Even an election is just an election. These things matter. They are important. They do have a significant influence on the direction of our society. But we are more than our votes. We are more than our elections. And we should learn from history about the mistake of placing too much faith in the promises of elected officials. Let's say that Donald Trump claims that he will be a champion of civil liberties, of human rights. Barack Obama campaigned on a platform very similar to this. He said he would close on the very first day of his administration the secret prison in Guantanamo Bay, where individuals are held without trial, indefinitely, without charge. He said he would end warrantless wiretapping in the United States. There would be no more mass surveillance of the kind that occurred in the Bush administration. He took office, instead of doing that, he actually expanded these programs in secret. He reshaped them and extended them to make them more invasive, more intrusive, and unfortunately, more entrenched, more defensible for the next administration. And this goes on and on and on, from torture and extrajudicial killings, all of these Bush-era crimes that the President, Barack Obama, claimed he would investigate. He would hold trials. These people would be accountable to the law, so these things would not happen again. He reversed that position once he was in office and said it's time to look forward, not backwards, setting aside the fact that every investigation, all criminal accountability, is necessarily looking back to the past, because that's what an investigation means. It means finding facts that actually happened in the days before. This creates the central friction, the challenge that we face, which is that promises are promises. The claims of elected officials can be good or bad, but they're never enough. If we want a better society, if we want a more free society, we can't wait for politicians. We can't rely on promises. We're going to have to build it ourselves.
And you mentioned, when you started to answer this question, about not focusing on individuals, but let me contradict you, if I may. On another one of your tweets, you highlight the relevance of every individual when you say that probably small groups made a difference. Can you highlight on that?
Yeah, what I'm talking about there is the dynamic between individual politicians, right? Individual officials, political personalities, right? The names and faces that we see on TV that draw all of the focus away from larger systemic injustices, larger systemic problems that we actually need to be resolving. Because we can defeat a politician, but that doesn't mean we defeat a policy, right? And it's the policy that actually needs to be changed. The thing about the action of individual citizens is that small committed groups of people working together relentlessly, tirelessly, over time, is what results in those changes to policy. Because politicians have term limits. Politicians come and go. Officials get fired, they get rehired, they get involved in scandals, and they disappear. They evaporate from the news and leave us only with the smell of sulfur and bad memories. But those policies remain, and so do we. Citizens last much longer than politicians. And by banding together, by cooperating, by remaining focused, we can ultimately, in the fullness of time, have more influence and more power if only we recognize it.
Wonderful. Ed, if you want to, we can open the floor to questions. I'm going to translate them to English, so just give me a few seconds every time, okay? Okay,
Sure.
let's start. Preguntas. Sí, vamos.
Do you have any reason to think that your chances of getting a pardon will change under President Trump?
I suppose that presumes that I have an understanding of what my chances of pardon are. I look at it a little bit differently. It's not my place to ask for pardon. I haven't done it, I won't do it. I am incredibly grateful to the many people who have. The world's three leading human rights organizations, Amnesty International, the American Civil Liberties Union, and Human Rights Watch, have joined together to petition the President of the United States, Barack Obama, to end the war on whistleblowers, right? To stop persecuting sources of journalism in exactly the way we've discussed today, who reveal matters of criminal activities occurring within government. And this is not a claim, right, to say that these were unlawful activities happening in the United States that were revealed. These have been affirmed by our own courts in the United States. The president himself signed reforms to law as a result of these newspaper reports. The United Nations found that these activities were a violation of human rights and had been for decades. We simply didn't know about it. And to say, look, pardon is appropriate in many of these circumstances. Will Donald Trump have the same position? Who knows? But ultimately, what happens to me is not so important. I knew the risks when I came forward. And if I was only comfortable, if I was only concerned with my own safety, my own future, I never would have left Hawaii. I would still be working at the NSA today. But sometimes we have obligations to something more. Sometimes our obligations transcend non-disclosure agreements, even statutory laws. And we answer to higher authorities. And I can say that I'm comfortable with the decisions that I've made. No matter what happens to me, I'm prepared to face it. And I'm proud that I did. In the final calculus, I've done what mattered to me the most. And I've done what I hope was the best that I could for the society that we have today and the future that we will all share. And whether or not, President Obama changes his position, or the next president or anyone else changes their position, we should never lose focus of what matters the most. And that's the fact that this is not about me. This is about us and the kind of rights we want to enjoy, the kind of society that we want to build, and the kind of future that we want to pass to our children.
Thank you. Next question.
Thank you. I'd like to ask two questions. One is related to our situation in Argentina. In Argentina, all the surveillance measures are being taken not because of national security issues or terrorism, but because of criminal cases and local security. Following that trend, a recent measure taken by the government is a registry of all the mobile numbers of all the users in Argentina. I would like to ask your views on this kind of measure. And the last is a very, very special interest I have myself, is your opinion on electronic voting.
Did you hear the last question?
Yeah, so I lost a little bit of the last question. I think it was about electronic voting.
That's right.
Which I'll try to get to it in a minute, because these are big questions. But the main challenge here is that there are ways to target cell phones and learn the identities of people and users, their locations, their activities, without monitoring everybody in a society, without requiring the registration of everyone in an entire nation, everyone in an entire country. And we've seen this, right? Crimes have been successfully investigated and prosecuted for decades. And they will continue to be in the next decades, whether or not these changes to laws are realized. To say, hey, let's start registering everyone. The government needs to know who has what phone. The government needs to know who's having what conversation. We want to start putting names to the numbers. And how is this done? This is done through many different mechanisms, hacking, law enforcement methods, things like this, where they go to the judge, they say, this individual's phone, this phone number is a criminal's phone number. We want to use the phone company to start recording all the phone calls that are made by these phones. Or we want to move the phone company out of it, and we want to actually hack into this iPhone, this Android phone, turn the GPS on it, turn the microphone on it, take pictures from the camera or whatever. All of these things are possible, and they're done routinely today in every country of the world. This is not to say that no case can be made to say that they want to have a more complete record system, but we should recognize the dangers of them, particularly in countries with troubled pasts, where there have been true moments of persecution, where unionists, where activists, where dissidents have been disappeared, where they have been murdered, where they have been tortured, or where they have simply been oppressed in their political views or made to be intimidated. Do we want to risk empowering institutions with a troubled history? You can rename an intelligence agency every year for the next 20 years if you want, but that won't make its activities any different. The only thing that will is outside influence, is accountability to the law. And the only way to ensure that is not to simply change the name of an agency and then rehire a generation of officials that were previously tossed out for bad behavior. It's to actually hold those officials who had broken the law, who had violated the tenets of trust that tie together our society, to put them in court, to put them on trial. And whether you convict them or not, at least make them answer for their bad behavior and justify it to a jury of ordinary citizens.
Do you want to highlight anything more in particular regarding the electronic voting?
Oh, right. I apologize. Electronic voting is complicated. We just had a national election in the United States, again, which is a very rich society. We have a tremendous economy. And we can throw around a lot more resources than many other countries that are much more constrained. And yet, despite that, the weekend prior to our most recent election, we had security researchers publishing demonstrations of attacks they had performed against our current voting machines that showed that they could change the registry of votes, both in the electronic register and the printed register that originated from electronic voting machines. Many people will say electronic voting can be done securely, that it can be done more cost effectively, and we would like to believe that. But unfortunately, today, there is no established track record that shows that is the case. It would be wonderful to be able to embrace electronic voting. But as of right now, we simply have not established the tools in a manner that has been proven in an academic format to be sustained, not just for this next election, right? But when these same machines will be used for the next election and the next election, because these machines aren't simply repurchased every time an election comes around with the newest technology. They'll be with us for a very long time.
Hi, Mr. Snowden. It's an honor to talk to you. I just want to ask a short question about what do you think about the biometric data collection in different countries as a massive policy with different goals or meanings, for example, to social policies or security policies. The biggest one, I think, and perhaps the scary one, is Aadhaar in India, when we have a national database of all the population, including iris, and without any law, and this is like a 15% of world population in a single hard drive. So and this is used, of course, in for example, to expel immigrants in Europe and from the United States. So what do you think about this now and in the future perspectives?
There are a lot of problems with the current approaches to biometric identifiers, their collection, their sharing and use. One of the issues that we look at most strongly is the fact that they're being used as, they're being presumed to be unspoofable, meaning they can't be forged, right? They can't be faked. And that they're secure. No one else is going to have them. Only you have your fingerprint. Only you have your iris. Unfortunately, this information is digitized, just as our current passwords are and have been. And this is a tremendous vulnerability because we see this happen all the time. Biometric databases have been hacked, they have been lost, they have been leaked. Just as with other password databases, right? And we see this happen all the time. Hackers break into Yahoo's email servers. They steal the passwords of all of their users. And the company goes, oh my goodness, we had a weakness in our security. We've lost all of your information, but don't worry. We've pushed an update to force you to change your password, to change this identifier that gives you access to our system and services. Someone else who's stolen your password will no longer be able to use it as soon as you change it. But you can't change your fingerprint. You can't change your iris. You can't change your facial geometry once it's been stolen. And this creates a tremendous vulnerability in any system that is founded upon the use of these kind of technologies. Is as soon as someone has access to these things, and we see a number of attacks that are already being used today that are trivially demonstrable. They don't require access to expensive equipment or careful techniques. For example, for breaking into individuals' cell phones on the base of their fingerprints, right? You simply take a copy of a person's fingerprint off of a water glass or something like that. You print out a semiconducting ink that follows that same pattern of the fingerprint, and then you put it against the sensor, and the sensor can't tell the difference between your fingerprint and this piece of gelatin or this piece of paper or anything else, because computers can't tell the difference. Now, officials will say, oh, well, you know, we'll have humans to tell the difference in this way and that way. And in some cases, this will be effective, but in many more, they will not. And the more we come to rely on these systems, the more we try to exploit biometric data as a shortcut for controlling and influencing the lives of millions of people around the world, the more we will recognize the weaknesses in the fundamentals, in the foundation of this idea that you can transform the biology of a person into a digital identifier that can never be abused.
Right. Sí, next question.
Mucho gusto. Mira, mi nombre es Adriana Reisfeld. Yo soy integrante de Memoria Activa. Mi hermana falleció en el atentado a la AMIA. Nosotros pedimos, por intermedio de un estudio de abogados en Estados Unidos, un informe al FBI. Y este vino tachado y como enmendado, y realmente no pudimos tener ninguna información. Quería saber...
Espera que ya le traduzco hasta ahí. The person that is going to ask you now, she's a member of a group that is trying to push for justice on an attack, on a bombing attack occurred in 1994. They asked for help and information from the FBI, and all that they got back was a memo or a letter fully redacted, you know, with blank spaces and so on. Sí.
Yo quería saber si es lo habitual que los informes que reciba Argentina vengan enmendados o tachados, entonces no haya nada, y si, por otro lado, si vos sabes algo que tenga que ver con el atentado a la AMIA.
And therefore, she's asking if that kind of redacted documents coming from the FBI are usually that way. Is that normal or not? And second is, if for any reason, given your activities and knowledge, if you know anything else regarding the AMIA bombing occurred here in Buenos Aires in 1994.
Unfortunately, I don't have any special knowledge. I have a policy that I never reveal classified information, my own personally, directly, from the archive of documents or my own personal history. Rather, I let journalists make these decisions on the basis of an understanding of what these documents say and what I know. so that they can determine the public interest without my political biases, without my own feelings and instincts in here, because I'm trying to restore the system of checks and balances that our government is supposed to be operating on. And therefore, I try to do my best to make sure that I'm operating in accord with the same kind of values, that I'm not elevating myself to a position to reveal information on my own, to exploit secrecy and so on and so forth for my own purposes. But that being said, I'll be very clear that no, I don't know anything about this personally. As for, is this normal? Is this usual? It's unfortunately more common than it should be. And I think this is a tragedy. We have seen in the United States, the FBI particularly, and all of our secret organizations more generally, intentionally redacting documents for the purposes of sheltering individuals or policies or procedures from judicial review. We have seen this documented also in other countries such as the UK, where their surveillance intelligence agency, the British version of the NSA, called the GCHQ, revealed that they had classified mass surveillance not because if it became public, these programs would become ineffective and lives would be lost, terrorist attacks would succeed, it would be a danger to national security. But instead, they were classifying it. Instead, they were redacting these programs. Instead, they were blanking out the pages of public knowledge because they feared a, quote, this is their own words, a damaging public debate about the scale of their activities. They were afraid, in their own words, of legal challenges against these programs to establish accountability, to achieve justice. Now, this is not to say that this is what's happening in this particular case. I simply don't know. But I think it's a very sad thing that we have to deal with even the possibility.
Hello, Mr. Snowden. I think that hearing all these questions makes kind of silly right now, but at some point you talk about public misunderstanding of reality. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, I mean, there's this idea that we have this big debate, we have all this media, we have all of these connections. We have such a mastery of science and facts today that we know how the world works. And yet, when we do surveys, we see extraordinary figures like 30% of Americans believe that the sun revolves around the Earth rather than the other way around. Now, some of these things are just basic scientific illiteracy, right? Or they're simple mistakes. But these are around the most bare facts, right, of basic education. Why does the sun rise and why does the sun set? If 30% of people get that wrong, what happens when we start to move into the realm of politics, where things are less clear, when things can be debated, when things can be justified, when even bad arguments can be made that seem convincing, even if they're contrary to facts? Well, this results in a public misunderstanding of fundamental realities. And that's dangerous enough, right? Because that affects our votes, that affects our outcomes, that affects what's a popular opinion, and what is too dangerous to say in polite company, even if it's entirely correct. But what's more dangerous? What's more dangerous is the same thing actually happens in the expert class. The same thing actually happens in the political class, where we have politicians who truly, without malice, without intending to be villainous, without intending to do the wrong thing or to, ruin our societies, truly believe in something for which there is no factual basis or only a light factual basis, and is reassuring for them to believe or comfortable to believe or justifies their policies, but simply isn't true.
Tal, mucho gusto, mi nombre es Claudio Mardones, soy periodista del diario Tiempo Argentino. Hace un año tuve la oportunidad de hablar con Vi Edwards, que es de la organización Whistleblower en Washington, y ella contaba que en su defensa de Tom Drake, Una de las cuestiones que sabían antes de 2001 es que tanto la NSA había considerado de que una de sus funciones principales estaba en duda antes del 2001. Quería preguntarte, a partir de la elección de Donald Trump, ¿cuál es la posibilidad y la perspectiva que va a tener en el futuro tanto la NSA como el FBI, como los distintos organismos de inteligencia del Departamento de Justicia? ¿Cuál va a ser la posibilidad de recuperar parte de su autonomía a partir de la reconfiguración del nuevo inquilino de la Casa Blanca?
The question is that given now that President Trump is about to take office, which are the real chances of the NSA or the FBI and some other agencies of regaining some autonomy and some independence? ¿Está bien así la pregunta? Sí. And that's coming from an Argentine journalist.
Okay. Yeah, I think the primary mistake in the premise of the question, I know it was compressed, but as it came to me, is that the NSA, the FBI, and all of them have acted some agency, have lost some autonomy in deciding to do whatever it is that they really want to do. And they haven't. We have had some reforms in the United States, but they are only the beginning of what was necessary. They were by far not enough. They only prohibited the mass surveillance of Americans' phone calls in the calling records of everybody in the country, right? This was a program that had sort of ingested records of every phone number that everybody dials at every time on every phone network, and they were held by the government. This reform changed this program a little bit so the government could no longer hold this data. Only the phone companies had to hold this data instead. And then the NSA would ask for this information, or the FBI would ask for this information, which is an improvement, right? But it doesn't resolve the fact that everybody's communications are still being recorded and held by these phone companies. They are still accessible to these groups in many cases without enough access to meaningful legal process. The hard work of reforming the actual dynamics of the basis of mass surveillance policies, this idea of bulk collection, where governments say, we'll store records of all your phone calls, all your internet activities, we'll save everything at the phone companies or whatever, for everyone. Wrong. Even if they're not a criminal suspect, even if it's simply your grandmother picking up the phone to tell you about a recipe for dinner, they want to have a copy of that. Is what needs to be changed. This is what needs to be litigated. And unfortunately, the courts in the United States have not considered this central question. And in many cases around the world, governments are working very hard to make sure this question is never answered in court. We do have the UK, who is passing the most extreme and intrusive surveillance measure in the Western world right now, called the Investigatory Powers Bill. It's a gross violation of human rights that is very likely to be challenged. The UK's departure from the European Union that's projected, at least partially justified on the basis that it will keep the European Court of Human Rights and other human rights bodies from ruling on the legalities of these programs. This isn't about Donald Trump. This is a global issue, right? And if we're going to resolve it, we have to have global solutions. And this raises the question of, well, what can we do if these governments, beyond borders, beyond jurisdictions, each of them all in their own little ways, are trying like hell to stop judges from judging whether these things should actually be happening? And the answer is we'll have to move into a segment of human history which we don't want to, but is increasingly becoming likely, which is where we recognize that law is only the barest guarantee of our rights. And increasingly, it is no longer an effective guarantee of our rights. And we may have to start looking for new means of enforcing human rights, new mechanisms for ensuring that our rights are not simply letters on a page that are disregarded, but something meaningful, something that works not just in Argentina, not just in the United States, but works in every country and every corner of the earth. And that means using science and technology, principles that are mathematical rather than political, to ensure that your rights are something that you can truly rely on.
Well, a little question about electronic voting. Assume a small country wants to establish a system of electronic voting. Do you think that a third country, some world power, will have an interest and the capability to alter the results in that country?
Of course. I mean, this is not much of a question in terms of a yes or a no, because this is what intelligence agencies are for, right? Interfering in foreign elections is what they've done for as long as they've been around. Whether this is lawful, whether this is appropriate, we can have differences of opinions. But whether it is clandestine funding of a political party that's established overseas, whether it's threatening changes in policies or relationships, if a party or politician that you don't agree with comes into power, or whether it's directly trying to hack and affect election results, these are things that have happened and likely will happen in the future. The question that we need to be thinking about is how do we defend against them and ensure that they're not effective?
Yes. While you were speaking, you made a statement that I think it's very interesting, or question. You said, when is secrecy really necessary? And let me share with you that our government thinks that secrecy is necessary always and at all times. In Argentina, secrecy is a rule for everything regarding intelligence, not only by our executive branch, but by our congressmen also. The executive branch claims that everything must be kept secret, including the identity of the support staff, not the spies or agents, but also support staff. And our congressmen think that their activities that are the ones that are responsible of controlling the intelligence agency must be kept secret from us.
And let me add also the budget of the agency.
Yes, that includes the budget. So I would like you to share with us, or a comment, or what would you say to our government and to our representatives regarding secret?
Well, they sound a little bit like that army man sitting on the bench beside your house who tells you about all the stories of the great things that they did during the day, but you can't actually tell. You don't even know how much you're paying for this person, apparently, because it's not a crazy fantasist living next door. It's a person who taxes you. But in seriousness, right, this is something that should be pushed back upon. This is something that should be challenged, and this is something that fundamentally should be changed. Because the question is, who holds the leash of government? Is it the intelligence agencies, or is it the secrecy goes to...
Excuse me, Edward, can you repeat that last comment because the internet stopped it?
Sure. Who is it that holds the leash of government? Is it the intelligence agencies? Are they the spies? Or is it the citizenry? Is it the public? If we allow secrecy to run amok and say, we're not going to classify just the things that are truly necessary, the bare outlines, or sorry, the specific details of investigations, the names of people who are being targeted or suspected of crimes, but we are also going to classify even the barest outlines of the policies and the programs and the powers that the government is claiming and pursuing. That which is done in your name and also against you. You're no longer partner to government. You're simply subject to it. And that is a very different relationship than one that is promised in democracies. We are not supposed to be subjects to government. We are supposed to be the boss of government. And if we can't even know how much their activities cost us, that's a very dangerous thing. The idea that even support staff, even vague policies can't be discussed in oblique manners without jeopardizing the whole of society is a fantasy, and we know this because we have history upon which to draw. There has been leak after leak of intelligence programs and policies in many different countries around the world. One need only look to the United States very recently to see programs that in 2013, when they came out, the government said would be the end of the world. The oceans were going to boil off. The atmosphere was going to ignite. But only 1 year later, the director of the National Security Agency, said that having the blanket torn away from him actually hadn't had that much impact on his job. The sky wasn't falling. The work was continuing, and it was still effective. The director of national intelligence, the most senior intelligence official in the United States, who 3 years earlier had lied under oath to Congress, which is a felony, of the NSA to keep them secret, the fact that they were secretly collecting records on millions and hundreds of millions of Americans, was asked, does the rise of encryption, of new technologies, this adversarial journalism that shows citizens what's actually going on, damage your ineffectiveness? Does it mean you're not going to be able to continue your work? And he said, in what he thought was a private conversation at a national intelligence conference, but in fact had a journalist in the room, a journalist, Barton Gellman, said, no, actually it won't. Because even if our adversaries know what we're doing, we'll still be effective. We'll still find ways in. We'll still catch them. Because the reality is, they must communicate if they want to be effective. At some point, they're going to have to pick up the phone. At some point, they're going to have to use an email. At some point, they're going to have to use the internet. And we'll be there. We'll be waiting. We'll be watching. And even if they're careful, eventually they will make mistakes, and we will catch them. This is true. This is my own professional experience at the NSA, where I was reading the emails of hackers who were using encryption day to day in all of these activities on a regular basis. So if the government of Argentina or any other country that's dealing with small-time criminals says, oh, if we tell the public, if we tell officials the general details of these activities will lead to the end of our republic, it would be great if we could see some bare evidence for the fact that that is the case. Whenever intelligence operations are revealed, even in the abstract, even peripherally, there are these alarmist claims of damage, alarmist claims of harm. But never do we see evidence of the actual harm that came to pass. Perhaps a starting point in this conversation would be, we need the intelligence services of Argentina to provide a public list of the damage that has come as a result of previous disclosures.
Yes, we have talked extensively about how these agencies collect all sorts of information. Could you comment on their ability to protect the information they collect, say, from foreign governments or even criminal organizations?
Well, again, I'll use the United States as an example here because it's the one most familiar to me. And I should caveat this again by saying the NSA is not a villain. They're not a bad guy. They're not the worst in the world. These are generally, at the working level, good people doing bad things for what they believe are good reasons. When you get to the decision makers, things start to get a little scary because politics tends to have a corrupting influence on the operation of intelligence. But When we think about safeguarding secrets, it would be hard to come up with a clearer example of how incapable these organizations are. Even the things they consider to be the sort of highest secrets than what happened in 2013. I was working as a private contractor, not a direct employee of the NSA. The President of the United States described me as a 29-year-old hacker, rather than some senior official, rather than some sort of trusted insider. And yet, despite this, despite the fact that I didn't graduate from high school, right? I'm not a super genius. I don't have a PhD, right? I'm not a doctor of anything. Walk into the National Security Agency, gather evidence of their darkest criminal activities, and deliver them to journalists. And these were their most classified documents, without them realizing it until they saw the reports on TV. Now, the United States intelligence, when you combine military programs and civilian programs, is a $75 billion a year budget. Argentina's budget is classified for intelligence. But I think it's fairly safe to say, if the United States could not do it for $75 billion, expect Argentina is not spending more on it.
Final question.
Hi, Edward. Thank you very much for using and taking your time to talk with you. I'm Gaston. We talked earlier. A week and a half ago, we met with an extensive group of civil rights and human rights organizations in Johannesburg. And we also talked with you about these problems, and you highlighted the real problem that these practices of massive surveillance are being used by both authoritarian regimes and democratic regimes, including the most ancient, or the US practice that you announced briefly. So my question is, take in consideration that, how much optimism do you have for the future, and what recommendation for you will be for the global movement of civil society in order to challenge these practices in these challenging times?
This is a big question that boils down to basically, how do you fix everything? And I have to confess that I don't have the answer to that question. We all have ideas, right? And that's actually where the value and the path forward comes from, is we need solidarity, discussion, and cooperation. We need to work together. Because ultimately, they have higher budgets than we do. But there are more of us than them. And when we think about the great challenges that are facing us today, the fact that technologies that were designed to empower us are increasingly being used to disempower us, we need to start thinking about not just narrow reforms, which are what government is trying to use to sort of release the steam valve of pressure of discontent about their activities, but how do we get fundamental changes? How do we get structural changes to the status quo that has disempowered the public to the point that if intelligence agencies wanted to radically control society, if they wanted to shape the direction of our future in a way that was very anti-democratic, I'm not saying they are, but considering the hypothetical that they were, we would have almost no capacity to resist them. It's quote a day, and that's what has to change, and it has to change quickly. And I think the only way to do that is to change our technology. We have to deal with this in a manner that's closer to direct action than civil action. This does not mean we abandon civil action. This does not mean we abandon efforts to reform laws. We should, because we don't want to be in an arms race with organizations and structures and industries that have been perfecting this process for hundreds of years. That's not a fair fight. But what we do need to do is establish the breathing room in which we can rebalance things to a little bit of a more fair status quo, and at least give us the space for our youth, for our academics, for our researchers, to begin to design new paradigms of communications that are not vulnerable in the fundamental way to these same mistakes of our past.
Edward, thank you very much for your openness and your time. We hope to see you someday, maybe in Argentina with an asado, or otherwise we'll meet in the US or in Russia. We never know. Thank you very much for your time.
I would love to see you in person.
Great.
I'd love to see you in person next year.
Bye-bye.
Stay free.